So, chapter one of this book talks about the history behind uh, scientific racism, which is the term given that describes how slavery and racism in and of itself was justified, from falsified reports to just made up um, scenarios, medical anomalies, stuff like that, about African Americans that uh, kind of painted them in a inferior position. Again, the justification for slavery and racism. Um, it also kind of talked a little bit about, or set up the structure for how the rest of the book was going to discuss medical experimentation on blacks, and how this has led to a distrust in the um, between African Americans and the United States medical system as it is. Chapter 2 goes a little bit more in about the experimentation on blacks and how it was done without their consent. I mean, slaves in and of didn't have an opportunity to say no, I don't want to do this. They did what uh, whites told them to do, and that was about it. Um, and even if information was given to them about what was going to happen, which was rare, it was very limited, and sometimes they were lied to about what was actually going to happen. And I think that really sets up the rest of the books that talk about more infamous um, experimentation done on African Americans. Um, it also kind of goes into the fact that blacks were a large portion of the experimentation subjects, the test subjects. Uh, I think a lot of experimentation did happen in the South, research in the South, and because blacks made up a large majority of the South, or at least the largest population of blacks in America were in the South, I should say. Um, it was kind of obvious, who the target should be. And then it also kind of talked a little bit about abolitionism and how when it started to become popular, scientists were like, wait a second, people aren't accepting our uh, medical research literature anymore because they're seeing that we're doing these cruel experiments on African Americans, and for some reason they don't like that. So maybe we should start hiding our who or what race our test subjects were. And I thought that was pretty interesting, that it also included Thomas Jefferson. Chapter 3, this was kind of interesting because I had always heard about the World Fair, and in the history that I was taught of it, I think the major focus was more about the art and the music that encapsulated this World Fair. I didn't know. I was unaware that blacks, especially those with deformities, were paraded around and used as freak shows, for entertainment. I was unaware of that. It was an interesting situation to read about Henry Moss's case, in which he exploited himself. Essentially, he made advertisements saying, "Hey, I've got this rare skin condition. Um, basically, I'm turning white, and what's happening, and all that kind of stuff." But yeah, I think that kind of plays into the modern exploitation that African Americans do to themselves in today's age as well, through multiple facets of media. Um, and I think this chapter really kind of ties all that uh, into a correlation of today as well. So, chapter 6 was especially interesting to me because it talks about the mulatto hybrid theory, which was the discussion on, or the belief that those that were lighter skinned or mixed breed, the um, half white, half black slaves and even freedmen were weak, frail, and they would die sooner than everybody else. And I think that was kind of interesting that they had to use that excuse to kind of, um, I guess, extinguish the fear that a lot of white people were having that, oh my gosh, they're taking over our country, there's way too many of them, and all this kind of stuff. And I say it's interesting to me because being half black and half white, I think this kind of ideology has made its way into the colorism issue of today, and that I've heard from a lot of darker skinned African Americans that if I show any sign of emotion or sensitivity, it's because I'm light skinned. And it's interesting to note kind of where that mentality even began. Um, Kind of also talks a little bit about how notably black diseases, um, during that time, eventually were found out to not be black diseases at all, but instead affected a wider variety of ethnicities. So that was interesting. And that includes sickle cell anemia, which I think goes into further detail later on in the book as well. So chapter 7 was the most interesting to me because of the fact that I heard a lot about and read a lot about and had to write papers on the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. Um, the one thing that I didn't know and I was not made aware of through any of the readings or um, any of the studies that I'd had to read to write the papers that I've written before was that it was 25 years after the fact that President Clinton officially apologized to what remained of the survivors. That was severely interesting and um, ultimately really sad to read that it took that long before someone actually finally said something. But this chapter in and of itself definitely solidified that reasoning behind why a lot of African American um, patients have a distrust towards the American health system. Chapter 8, Eugenics. Interesting chapter to read about simply because it talked a lot about how yes, eugenics was kind of like a worldwide discussion um, with its selective breeding, but in the United States, it was used to control the black population because, of course, we're hypersexualized, unintelligent beasts that will go around and have sex with everything and just continue to get everyone pregnant. So yeah, that was interesting. Margaret Sanger, I had heard the name before, didn't really know exactly what she was responsible for. So reading about her funding or founding, excuse me, Planned Parenthood, well, the company that eventually would become Planned Parenthood, was quite interesting. I know about Planned Parenthood. A lot of that has been in the media, the news, and other types of media recently. Um, but I didn't know that this person that was touted as uh, the founder of feminism kind of really had her intentions on the more um, racist side. So yeah, that was kind of interesting to read. Chapter 10 talks about how the prison system was a prime pool for test subjects. And of course, with African Americans being a large portion of the population in prison systems, more African Americans were the ones that were being experimented on. Um, One aspect of this chapter that was really interesting was the cosmetic testing that happened in the 1950s and 60s from Dr. Albert Klingman. When he went into Holmesburg prison and tested more than 150 experimental drugs and cosmetics on the inmates, causing them to have all types of weird reactions, so much so that people could go to the beach and see, who had been in those experiments based on, patches that they had on their skin. Um, and despite all the experimentation that ended up being done on African American prisoners, they continue to remain invisible in the medical literature. I think that kind of still played on the earlier chapters, which talked about how physicians and scientists kind of hid the ethnicities of their subjects to kind of keep their research legitimate. So, chapter 11. Chapter 11 was tough. Talking about how black children were heavily exploited in scientific research. Um, in a lot of senses, almost exclusively. Um, including, horrific brain surgeries that thought to cure behavioral issues. Um, since black boys in particular were always labeled as born criminals. That was hard to read, and of course that further strengthened the iatrophobia that's experienced in the black community in and of itself. Chapter 12 talks about DNA testing and how it has its pros and cons. One of which being one pro, of course, being the clearing of African American males and females from the crimes that they didn't commit. That's huge. Um, Again, this chapter kind of went a little bit further into sickle cell anemia and how it was not a black disease per se, but it was still, you know, attributed to blacks more often than not. Um, even to the point of where eugenics kind of crept its weird little head back into the conversation and saying uh, black people were getting screened for this sort of or for this disease. Excuse me. Um, and erroneously told that, or at least those that had the trait, not the disease, that they did have the disease and they were sick and that they shouldn't, you know, breed or anything like that because uh, they didn't want to, have sick babies. And this kind of caused an uproar. And it's also interesting to read about how employers today still kind of uh, use genetic testing to find uh, predisposed, even potential employees to certain diseases, so that way they can decide not to hire them, so their liability insurance it doesn't have to cover them. And of course, there's some racial bias that seemed to be present there as well. Um, since there were some legal cases, I think, that came up in which these black employees had been tested without their consent or knowledge. So, and they were looking for, these traditionally black diseases. Chapter 13, um, another explanation of how the system found a way to arrest black people. um, they basically said if you're sick and you don't follow doctor's orders, it's a means for us to arrest you until you're not sick anymore. They basically use the excuse, well, we don't want you to be contagious and infect other people. So um, that's fun. And then it goes more into AIDS as a black disease. And of course, it wasn't initially touted as such. It was a gay disease at first, um, but as more black people became infected or were being tested and shown to be infected, um, and with more black people being in poverty-stricken areas, which were subjected to um, higher research and poor science, poor techniques in experimentation, which again fed into the high contraction rates for African Americans um, for this disease. Um, yeah, it became another black disease. It became a black issue as much as a gay issue. Um, and of course, with black people being subjected to higher poverty rates, um, they were on healthcare plans that did not support or did not provide um, any additional help to allow them to pay for this expensive medication. Um, so it is good that now you see it at $140 annually, which makes it a lot more affordable and a lot more available to blacks. So that's a good part there. And then, of course, the very last thing that we had to read for this book was the epilogue, um, which kind of fights against the natural telling of the book, which kind of provided all these examples for why blacks should be concerned and wary about experimentation, by still saying, hey, we need you in research, which is true. Black people are needed in research, both on the testing side and the getting tested side, because we play an important role. Unfortunately, all the past mythologies that were placed on African Americans before, all these negative stereotypes, got transferred to Africa because there's less representation, more poverty, and so it is effectively becoming has become the continent of subjects, as the book put it. That is sad. It's unfortunate, and there should be something done about that. And I think it kind of closes a little bit on, again, arguing that yes, blacks do need to be involved in scientific experimentation, but they should still be wary because informed consent is kind of eroding through several means. There's the double-blind studies and the triple-blind studies and all those blind studies that seek to kind of withhold certain information for the patients or subjects involved. So yeah, that was Medical Apartheid. Interesting book, interesting read. So yeah, thank you.